Good evening, everybody.
Kavod Tavad, how are you?
Baruch Hashem, thank you. Okay. Yeah, looks like we're going to bet. We did Aleph, I think. So it says in Bet Yosef like this. מה שכתב רבנו מדורה עשויה מעצים דקים מותר להסיר מהם. So that which the Torah said here, that if you're making a bonfire from twigs, you're allowed to remove the ones that haven't yet been lit up. So regarding that, says Bet Yosef, Eno inyan lememra zo. So it says it's not really related to this topic here, this discussion here. Rav Yehuda ela mipnei sheizkir din echad mimedura samach lo din zeh. So it says the reason why he wrote this is because since he mentioned the concept of the bonfire, he also included this, right? Which is not really, but it's not really in our topic. שהוא גם כן במדורה, ואחר כך סיים לפרש כל הדברים שנזכרו בממרה זו. So then he went to finish all the teachings that were said about this. דרב יהודה, קדרה ובעתה ופוריה וחביתה, right? Which is talking about the things that we mentioned, right? The pot, the bed, right? The eggs, whatever that you're putting on top of the arrangement of the wood or whatever. Or stone. Okay, so that's the story there. V'din zeh the medura hasuya me'etzim dakim ita b'perek bet betzah. So he says, where does this come from? This concept of a bonfire which is made from twigs. It's in Betzah Chabet Amud Aleph. Amar Rabbi Yehuda kinsa share. So it says Rabbi Yehuda, right? Kinsa is allowed. Kachu girsat arif. That's what it says in the Arif. U'pirsha kemo shkatav Rabbeinu. And he explains it like what the Torah said. V'chen piresh Aruch. Also the Rosh explains like that. B'shem ha'aruch, the name of the Aruch. V'chen piresh ha'mordechi, and also Bordechi. B'shem Rabbeinu Chananel, name of Rabbeinu Chananel. So what are they saying, right? That, we're talking about twigs, as we said, right? Which are like, thin pieces of wood, right? Very, very thin. Okay, so V'chen katav Rambam. Also Rambam says in the Perek Dalet, V'yistrich Rav Yehuda le'ashmuinan. So Rabbi Yehuda was trying to teach you what? The share, that it's allowed, right, to remove those twigs. So you shouldn't think, right, it resembles a case where, you're removing the oil from a candle, which is something which is not allowed. The asur. There's a Mishnah in the Masechet Shabbat, right? Bameh Madlikin. And over there it talks about this, right? So what's the problem, by the way? Let me just explain this to you. What's the problem if you have a candles, right, that you light with oil? You know, like a lot of religious ladies, right? The ones who are very exacting in mitzvot, when they light Shabbat candles, right? They don't use those wax ones and the paraffin, right? They light olive oil. So we're talking about that kind of thing, I don't know what you ladies do, but right, I don't know what you're using for Shabbat, whatever, but right, but the custom of many women who are very exacting, they use olive oil because it's considered to be the best way to do a Shabbat candle. Um, there are several reasons for that, but anyway, right? So it's telling you here that the thing is, right? Once you light a candle, which is made of oil, you can't remove any of the oil from the candle anymore. You ever hear this halacha? Even though, there's still more oil left in there in the candle, right? But you cannot remove the oil from there to use it for some other purpose. What's the reason for this? So the reason is because it extinguishes it, when you remove the oil. Not totally, but partially. It gets like dimmer, it dims it out. So therefore, this is the reason why the rabbi said, right? Don't remove the oil from your candle. Once it's already lit, for Shabbat, whatever, Yom Tov, because you're transgressing the prohibition of extinguishing the fire. So, right, right, but it says, right, so now it comes to tell you that even though we prohibit to remove the oil from the candle, but when you have like a bonfire going and you have like these little twigs, in there, so as long as it hasn't caught, the flames haven't caught it yet, you're allowed to remove them from there. So why is that? Because that's not going to extinguish the fire. Because each twig, is like an independent, entity, right? It's a separate piece. So it doesn't really affect the flame when you remove it, as long as, it hasn't caught on yet. That's what we're saying. But, right, on the other hand, once the flame already caught it, right, and got lit, so then it's forbidden to remove it from there, right? Because then you are extinguishing, right, somewhat, when you remove it, because that makes this flame smaller. Okay, so then it goes on. Miu mashma milashon rabbeinu the davka be'etzim dakim. So, but this implies from the Tur that only applies when you have twigs, right, thin, pieces of wood. Asur, that's when it's forbidden. Why is that? Because then it's considered to be like one piece. So what does that mean? Since they're like very thin, it's like they're all bundled together very tightly, and therefore, if you remove it when it's already lit, it's going to extinguish the flame. So this is the reason why you can't do that. Okay, interesting. So the Rambam Katab Pek Dalet Mi Aguda, right? So what does the Rambam say about this? It says like this, right? Aguda shel etzim. He says that you have a bundle of wood, right? Mashma דווקא באגודת עצים הוא דאין מותר להסיר מהם, אלא בשלו אחזה בהם הארור, ולא כשאחזה, אבל אם עצים גסים, אפילו אחזה בהם הארור מותר. So he says, right, that it's the same implication from the Rambam. What does that mean? That the words of the Rambam imply that only when it's like twigs, it's a problem. But if you're talking about big pieces of wood, so then it's not a problem, right? As we said, right? We gave the reason for that. להסיר מהם, אבל דרוקח סתם בכתב עצים שבאש אין לסלק. But the rokach, right, writes, just in general, any pieces of wood, you cannot remove from the bonfire, right? When is that? When it already caught on, right? Because if it didn't catch on yet, it's fine, no problem. Okay, right? So he says, right, the reason why you can't do this, as we said, is because you're extinguishing, This is the problem. So then he goes on, והמורדכי כתב על פירוש רבנו חננאל. So says the Mordechai, right? Regarding the explanation of Rabbeinu Hananel, the kisna share, that twigs are allowed. So he also says, right, that once the fire catches onto it, you're not allowed to remove them anymore. Yom Tov, and even on Yom Tov, right? All the more so on Shabbat, right? That would be even worse. מיהו לקח העוד מצד זה להניחו בצד זה של מדורה מותר. But it says if you want to take the ud, right? So now what's the ud? There's a name for this in English. It slips my mind right now, right? It's maybe it's called the ember. I don't know, whatever. I don't know, God knows. Anyway, right? We're talking about it's a piece of wood that that you use to to work with the flame, to control it, something like that. It's not ember. I'm sorry, it's a different name. Whatever it is. Anyway, so that you can move around. He says. Why is that? Because you're not intending to extinguish. When you do that, that's not your intention. Adkan. Okay, that's very interesting. Adkan. So in the second parak, he writes, right? It seems like this the Mordechai. כתב, ואם לוקח אדם אוד מן המדורה להאיר בלילה, לא דמה למסתפק מן השמן, right? So he says, if you're taking one, right, that piece of wood that we mentioned, right? If you take it away from the fire, so it doesn't resemble the case of removing, using the oil from the candle, right? Which we said is forbidden. So he says, but he says the custom is to be careful about that, right? In other words, to refrain from that. So meaning what? That you shouldn't even take that piece of wood, right? The one that you were using to control the fire, whatever that thing is called. So he says that's the proper thing to do to avoid this, to refrain from that. Okay, I can understand why. Because after all, you are extinguishing. That's the bottom line. Even though that's not your intention, but it's something which happens, it's like, it's a given. It's going to happen, So he says there are some who have this text, right, in Talmud. Instead of saying kinsa, which we said, right, are twigs, they have the text is kinba, right? So the question is, what is a kinba, right? So he says, it says it's explaining a different chapter, he says, right? Look over there. And 514, if you want to see, right? If you're dying to see what the meaning of that word is, look in that chapter. Okay, good. So we're done with this bit Yosef here. And that was bet, right? Yes, that was bet. Okay, good. So let's see the Shulchan Aruch. Up. No, what happened there? So it says Shulchan Aruch, אגודה של עצים שהודלקה במדורה. So you have here, right, a bundle of wood, and they made like a bonfire. כל עץ שלא אחזה בו האש מותר לשמטו. So the rule is like this, right, that as long as the fire has not caught on to that piece of wood yet, you're allowed to remove it. So it doesn't resemble the case of removing, right, the oil from the candle, as we said, right, which is forbidden. Okay, good. So says the Rama here, ומותר לקח עץ הדלוק בצד זה של מדורה ולהניחו בצד אחר, right? So he talks about that, right, that piece of wood, right, that you're using to control it, whatever. הואיל ואינו מכוון לחיבוי. So that, he says, the Rama, right, as we saw in Beit Yosef, you are allowed to move it around because you're not intending to extinguish, right? Even though it does happen somewhat, but that's not your intention. So interesting to see what the Mishnah Berurah says here about this, because it's not so simple, this whole thing. Let's see what he says. So he says, right, what we saw in the Bet Yosef, that the proper thing is to be stringent here. But anyway, the Rama seems to be lenient about this. Interesting. Yeah, okay, so that's pretty much the story. Yeah, so the proper thing to do is to refrain from this. But again, right, we don't have really this concept today. We're not really making bonfires, and we don't have all this stuff. So it's not really something that we actually use or whatever. But the concept does exist for us, So what does that mean, right? What's the concept here? The concept is like this: if you have a flame going on Yom Tov, right, and even right, especially on Shabbat, even more so, right? All the more so. You're not allowed to extinguish it, even partially. But here's the thing, right? Since we got into this discussion, let me tell you a couple of tricks, which are up my sleeve somewhere. Let me pull them out, right? And I'll tell you. One thing is like this, right? That let's say, it's brought down in the books, right? That if you have a dish, right, that you're cooking on Yom Tov, and it's going to get burned if you leave it on, right? If you leave it on the fire. So if you need to put the flame down, in order that it shouldn't get burnt, you're allowed to extinguish like that for that purpose. In other words, if your purpose is to avoid the food getting burned, you're allowed to extinguish. That's one thing, right? By the way, what I'm telling you now, even like somebody, that I remember when I was learning in yeshiva in Israel, in the Kollel, one of the big rabbis there, who's now a big shot, Dayan in Israel, right? He's a big shot now, right? Whatever. But one time I told him this, he says, so he was surprised, it tells me, he says, where is this written? He says, can you show me? So I showed it to him, and he was like, oh, gee. He didn't know, right? So, a lot of people don't know this, that you're allowed to, put the flame down in order that the food shouldn't get burnt. That's allowed. That's one thing. There's also another interesting thing, which is that extinguishing the gas, right, that you have on your stove is not exactly the same thing as extinguishing like a bonfire, It's not the same thing. Anybody know why that is? Whoever gets this one is a total genius. If you do it, because or you're just very lucky. I'm not really sure which one it is.
Extinguishing the bonfire takes exertion, no?
Well, I mean, I don't know. Not really, just to do a partial thing, right? It's not really much exertion there, Like, picking up some twigs, it's not really much exertion going on.
How do you extinguish it if it's a bonfire?
If you take the twigs out, when they're burning, you are extinguishing.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So, so then what's the difference between that and a gas? Right, so I'll tell you a secret, right? The difference is like this, that the gas, is as it's called, right? It's gas. You know what I mean? It's called gas, and it is a gas. So what does that mean? It's just air, There's nothing physical there, which is burning. You know what I mean? So what does that mean? When you extinguish the gas, there's nothing left from there. It's gone. Right? So here's the thing, that since that's the case, there's nothing left. So, because the reason why it's forbidden to extinguish on Shabbat and Yom Tov is because you're making coals. That's what they used to do in the Mishkan, right? As we talked about yesterday, right? The laborers come from the Mishkan, so that's what they did over there in the Mishkan. So therefore, right, it's only according to from the Torah, it's only forbidden to extinguish if you're making coals. But since the gas leaves nothing over, so there is no issue of making coals there. So therefore, right from there's really not much really of a prohibition there, to extinguish gas because there's nothing left over. That's the thing. The truth is, right, that in those days they didn't have gas, right? When these laws, were made in the Talmud, whatever, right? They didn't have it, so that means that the rabbis never decreed on that, obviously, right? Burning gas, they didn't have such a thing like that. So therefore, it's not forbidden, really, not from the Torah and not from the rabbis either. So the gas is like a little bit of a different thing, that's the thing. So therefore, extinguishing gas is much different than extinguishing a bonfire, right? It's not the same thing. Okay, well, the food for thought, right? Okay, right. I hope it didn't surprise you too much, whatever. So that's the way it goes. Yeah. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, we'll go on to the next one, Gimel, right, whatever. There may be some Bet Yosef left over that we didn't do. Let me just check, make sure we're up to date with the Bet Yosef. This one. Did we do this one? Yeah, I guess we should read this. I don't think we read this yesterday. It's like a big Bet Yosef, whatever. There may be some pertinent information here that we need to know. So let's go through it. With your permission. Okay. So it says like this. This is something we were talking about yesterday, right? Which is Mashkata Rabbeinu, right? And we said, right, that when you're putting the pot on top of the wood, you should do it the opposite, right? Way, with a shinui, right? With an abnormal manner. Le'el kai Rusem Perush, Memra de Rav Yehuda, de Amar Ken, V'chen Kida, V'chen Biata, V'chen Puria, V'chen Chavita, Ben Achshav Rabbeinu, Ben Achshav Rabbeinu. Ba'achshav Rabbeinu. Yeah. So, okay, that's, everything is pretty, we already know all this. He's telling you here, right, that it's the same thing as all the other things we mentioned. Okay. And then he goes on, right? So, right, then we talked about the issue of eggs, right? So we said, right, that there's a problem on Yom Tov or Shabbat, right? All the more so, right? Whatever. When you're piling up eggs, and making like a little bit of a pyramid there, right? The triangle there, right? Whatever. you shouldn't do this because of the prohibition of building. But it's only rabbinical, whatever. But anyway, right? Because obviously nobody's builds with eggs, right? So right. But anyway, right? It says here, "Kach perushu atosfot." That's what it says in Tosfot. She gives you the source for this. Ve'aran, also the Ran. Ulapukin Rashi shepiresh biata betzim gazot hanitnot al penei kol kli chalul can tripod, right? So, but right, Rashi explains it differently. He says, not like these Rishonim. What does he say? That we're talking about like large eggs that are placed on top of a hollow, right, utensil, which is called the tripod, right? Right. We call it tripod, something like that, right? Or ala askala, or some kind of thing there, some kind of grate, whatever. So since he's not making any partitions here, so therefore it's not really called building and it's allowed, he says. So what does the Rambam say? So Rambam says like this, right? You shouldn't place eggs like one layer on top of the other, on Yom Tov, right? As we said, right? Same thing on Shabbat, obviously. Right? Al Gav Shura. Ad Shiamdu Kamo Kamigdal. Until it looks like a tower, you're making some kind of a tower, some kind of a pyramid there. Right? Ela Yeshaneh V'Yatchil Mala Al-Mata. So Rambam says the same thing, right? As we said yesterday, which is that if you want to put like a pile of eggs, and pile them up like that, you should do it with an abnormal manner, right? What does that mean? Start from the top and go down, right? But don't go from down and move to the top. Okay, so then it goes on. Now he talks about the issue of the bed, right? We said yesterday also with the bed, the same thing. Right? So regarding that, it says Bet Yosef, Ken Katvu Tosfot Be'arosh, that's what it says in Tosfot Rosh. Shamu Mashma Medivri Tosfot, so it says implies in Tosfot, Shafa Pishesh Lein Mechitzot. So right, even though they do have partitions, right? Meaning what on the bottom, right? There's like it's not just legs, there's actually like partitions there. If they don't reach the ground, though, as we said yesterday, right? We mentioned this in the Ramah, if you remember. Muttar, then it's allowed. But we also said, right, if it's less than 3 tefachim to the ground, it's also a problem because it's considered to be like it's reaching the ground. How much is 3 tefachim? 3 fists, right? Which is 24 centimeters, right? Each fist is 8 centimeters. So if it's below that, within that, right, it's also considered to be on the ground. So therefore it's forbidden. We mentioned that yesterday. Okay, so let's go on a little bit. So then it says, right, okay, so he brings this concept and then he goes on, Perek Tolin, right? What about the Ran? Katab b'shem Rashba. It says in the name of the Rashba, Ta'am acher le'atir perisat shulchan. So he gives another reason why you're allowed to open a table, right, on Yom Tov. So in other words, there's no prohibition, of making a tent, right, or whatever, making a structure, making a building by opening a table, which is like folded up, whatever. On top of its on top of its legs. So the Rashba says, right, the reason why you're allowed to open a table is because you don't need the airspace under it, right? You're not opening for the airspace under it. So what do you need? You need to put something on top, right, on the table, but you don't need the space under. Right? That's what he's saying. But it says if there is a bed which you're using the airspace, which is under it, right? שתחתיה ונתינת סנדלים. Let's say you put your you put your shoes there, right? Everybody does that, right? Who doesn't put his shoes under the bed? So, so that means you are using the airspace under the bed, so then it's a problem. That's what he's saying, right? יוצא בהן כבר כתב גם כן רבינו בסמוך טעם זה בשם הרשב"א. So, right, Rabbeinu, the Tur already gave this reason in the name of the Rashba. ועל מordechai בפרק המביא כתב שני הטעמים. So Mordechai writes both of the reasons, right, that we just mentioned. And then he goes on, מה שכתב רבינו אבנים של בית הכיסא מותר לצדדם, right? And then we said, right, in the Tur, that there are things which are allowed, which are similar to this. So what's one of them? For instance, right, excuse my candor here. I hope you're not eating dinner right now, right? So I'm going to tell you, right? So, in those days, right, they didn't have toilets, like we have today, right? So what they would do is they would like pile up some, stones, right? And sit on top of it. That was their makeshift toilet, right? So that's what he's talking about here. So says the Tur, making like a toilet like that is not really forbidden. So in other words, there's no prohibition of making a structure, right? Why is that? I can imagine why that is, but let's see what it says here, right? Memra de Rab Nachman Perk, maybe it's written in the Talmud, right? The Bet Yosef says. Where is this? In Lamed Bet Amud Bet, right? In Betzah. Piresh Rashi explains there, Avanim Gedolot shemetzavlin otam liot kemin moshav chalul veyoshvin alehem, right? So that's what he says, right, Rashi? You're making like a makeshift toilet, right? And to sit on it, right? Besadot, right, in the field, right? In the old days, the toilet was like outdoors, outhouse, right? And, like the good old days. Right, which is made, to be like a bathroom there, So explains the reason in Gemara. What's the reason why it's allowed to do that? There's no prohibition of, making a structure, whatever. Mishum the binyan aray mideoraita share berabanan hu gazru be ve'acha mishum kavod habriot lo gazru. Incredible reason he gives over here, right? Why that's allowed. So he says, right, as we mentioned yesterday, when is building prohibited according to the Torah? When it's a permanent structure, right? So here, obviously, it's not permanent, right? It's a makeshift kind of a toilet. It's like you put it up, you put it down, right? Whatever, right? It goes up and down. It doesn't stay like that. So, right? But the rabbis decreed, right? Even something which is not permanent, not to do it. As we said, right? Like, when it comes to, all the things that we mentioned, right? Just now. The pot, the eggs, right? All kinds of things like that. Right? All that stuff, the wood. Okay, fine. But here, right, it says, because of kavod habriot. What does that mean? Because, a person needs to have a bathroom. You know what I mean? So it's a person's, it's, how do you say this, right? It's respect to people, right? That they need to have a toilet. So therefore, right, because of the respect, right? So therefore, the rabbis did not decree on this. They left that out of the decree. Why is that? Because they know people need this, right? They can't go without it, basically. It's it's a necessity. So therefore, they didn't decree on this. Okay. So therefore, right, making a makeshift toilet is allowed. Okay, thank you very much. There you go. So then he goes on, right? Mashkatav Rabbeinu Rashi Piresh the whole zed the law kilchata. So then, right, the Torah says that Rashi says, right, this is not the halacha. Well, so what is the Rashi going on? It's going on what we saw in the Gemara there, Laman Gimel Amud Aleph, Ve'ilchata yebeshta share ritivta asur. But Tosfot katvu, דוחקו לומר דכל הנה, מיני דלא כרבי שמעון אלא נראה לומר דאפילו רבי שמעון מודה דהכה דאסור דאמר רבי שמעון דבר שאין מתכוון מותר, היינו כגון שעושה דבר שאינו מתכוון לעשותו, אבל הכא מתכוון לעשות מה שהוא עושה. וגם הראש כתב. Okay, so very interesting, right? So it says here, right, there's a machloket here between Rashi and Tosfot, right, regarding this issue. The truth is, that it would probably serve us well to see this inside in the tour, because the whole thing is not really quoted here. So let's go over there to the tour and check it out. Okay, so let me see where it starts here. Right, so here's the tour. It says the tour, Rashi piresh techol zeh lo delo kilchata. So says Rashi, right, all this that we mentioned is not the halacha. Too bad, you wasted your time, right? Everything you learned has no significance, right? That's what Rashi's telling you, right? I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that's pretty much what he's saying, right? So, okay. So, regarding that, so Rashi says, why is all this not halacha? So he says, because we hold like Rabbi Shimon that says that what? That whatever a person is not intending to do, it's not his intention, it's allowed to do. So what is Rashi telling you here, right? Is it your intention here to make, a structure or to make a tent, right? Or whatever, in these cases? Obviously not, right? That's not your intention. Your intention is to cook, right? Whatever it is, right? To make a bonfire, right? Whatever it is, right? Who's looking to make a structure over here, right? Pretty ridiculous. So therefore, says Rashi, it's not halacha. So now, right? Aval ri piresh techashiv shapir mitkaven. So the ri says, right, which is Tosfot, right? The ri is one of the Balei Tosfot. So says the ri that this is considered to be like you're intending to do it. All these things, right? So Rashi is telling you, right, that this is not your intention with these things to make a tent, right, to make a structure. But Ri says it is. Oh, how is that, right? How does that work? Oh, so says the Ri, it is your intention. You know why? Because you're doing this intentionally. In other words, not exactly that you're looking to make a structure here, but what you are doing, right? It's like you're doing it willingly because you need that. And you want to use it for some purpose, right? So the Ri says that's called that you're doing it intentionally. Machloket between Rashi and the Ri, right? Which is one of the Balei Tosfot. The two big Balei Tosfot, by the way, who are they? The famous ones, right? The Ri and the Rabbeinu Tam. Those are the big guys in Tosfot, right? The other guys are also big, but these are like the top honchos, over there, right? So that's the way it is, right? Okay, so anyway, right? Okay, so I guess we're done with that. So let's go back to Bet Yosef now. Now we know, right, to where we're treading over here. So now we can understand the Bet Yosef better. So he says the Bet Yosef like this, right? V'gam harosh katab al divrei Rashi lo nehera. So he says, right, that the Rosh also argues with Rashi here. So he says, what does this have to do with the fact that you don't have the intention, right? What's the connection? Hare הוא עושה מה שמתכוון לעשות. So says the Rosh, the same thing, right? What do you mean? You don't have intention? You do have intention, right? You know what you're doing, right? And you're doing it for a purpose. So what does it mean you don't have intention? Good point. Right? And by the way, I think that's halacha. Halacha is like that. You know, that we say that that's called you have intention. And even though he's not really intending to build something here, right? In other words, he's not really building here. What is he? He's a construction worker, right? What is he? You know, he's not building nothing, but right. So he says, but it is an intention to do something which resembles building. That's good enough. Good point. And therefore the rabbis, you know, made a enactment, right, not to do this. They made a decree. They decreed not to do it. So what's the reason? Right, says the Rosh. What's the reason why the rabbis decreed here to not to do this? Because if they allow you to do this, you may also come to build something like a real structure. You know, one thing leads to another. So therefore the rabbi said, stop right there, right? Don't do that. Because if we allow you to do this, you might also come to build, you know, like whatever, you know, some kind of a garage, right, for your backyard, you know, whatever, right, on Yom Tov, you know. And that's a real building. So that's the whole thing. Okay, interesting. Good. Then he goes on. So it says, and therefore, says the Rosh, so therefore he says, we do paskin here like, you know, this opinion. We do. Not like Rashi who says, right, we don't paskin like this. Not correct. Also the Rif says like that, right? So you see, most of the Rishonim here, you know, right, argue with Rashi. Also the Rambam, right? So you see, right, that you have here about, you know, at least 5 Rishonim against Rashi. So therefore, right, Rashi's alone over here, right? He's a lone player over here, you know? What can you do, right? Lone soldier. So therefore, the halacha is not like him, right? That's what it is, basically, you know? Okay, so we have one more little piece here. That the Torah said, right? We already mentioned this in the Beit Yosef also. That what, according to Rashba, right, there's only a prohibition regarding this kind of thing if you want the airspace under it, right? You know, that's what the Rashba says. And therefore, right, if the legs of the bed or the table do not reach the ground, right, there's no prohibition, right? According to this, whatever, something like that, right? The bed may be yes, because you put your shoes under there. Okay, that's a little bit different, right? So be careful, you know, when you put your shoes under your bed, you should know you're making a big problem. I'm joking, you know, but you know, whatever, it is what it is, right? Okay, so you can keep putting the shoes under the bed. Don't worry, I'm not going to fight with you about that. So anyway, right? Says over here, right? The Ran also writes this. So it seems like he also agrees with the Rashba. In the name of the Tosfot. Interesting. So we do have some opinions like that, right? That the issue really here, you know, hinges on this, that are you using the airspace under it or not, right? That's interesting. Okay, that's the end of the Bet Yosef. Now, let's just go back for a second to the Shulchan Aruch, right, that we did yesterday, to see how this came out in the halakha. In other words, my question is only like this, right? Obviously, we don't pass like Rashi over here. That's clear, right? It's a given. But the question is, what about this opinion of the Rashba? Do we pass like that or not? So that's what I want to see, right? Make sure we get this straight. The truth is, you know, this opinion of the Rashba, I've seen it brought down like in contemporary books, you know. So it seems like we do paskin like this, like the Rashba, you know. So what does that mean? Whenever you're not using the airspace under something, there's no prohibition of making a tent, you know, whatever, something like that, right? That's the rule. Okay, so let's see. Look at the Shulchan Aruch, right? One more time. We'll look at the whole thing here. Second. Okay, so yeah, let's look at that. Right. So regarding what we said yesterday, right. So interesting. Hmm. Right. So the truth is, the Shulchan Aruch, he doesn't bring the opinion of the Rashba. But, right, I see here in the Ramah, he brings it, but, he brings it like, another opinion, like not really so much like halakha. Right. Interesting. Okay. So so we have to do a little bit more research about this, this issue. But I remember seeing in like in more the contemporary books that they do actually bring this. Interesting. But Shulchan Aruch doesn't bring it here. But he does bring it in the Bet Yosef, right? And sometimes, by the way, there are things, there's like a rule like this. There's all kinds of rules. Something which is brought in the Bet Yosef, right? But not brought in the Shulchan Aruch. Sometimes we paskin anyway, like what it says in Bet Yosef. So what does that mean? If it's not arguing with what it says in the Shulchan Aruch, right? That, just expanding on it. So then sometimes we do, So it could be that's the reason why. Okay, interesting. So that's the one we did yesterday, right? So let's go now to the one that was relevant to today. Right. So this is the one that we did today, if I'm not mistaken, right? Agudah shel etzim she'udaka b'nera, right? So it says, right, if a pile of wood was right. So I think we did this already. Yeah, we read this already. Mhm. Yeah, okay, we did it. So I guess we can wrap it up there. Okay, so Bezrat Hashem, thanks for coming. Be blessed with wealth and health and happiness. We'll see you tomorrow, Bezrat Hashem. Chazak Baruch, Laila Tov, and keep up with good spirits, Bezrat Hashem.
Kabbalah Tachaf, thank you so much.
God bless. God bless. All the best.
Amen.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
God bless.